Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagler coming to you with another Canadian federal election update. Now, just before we get into the video, I would just like to once again thank all of my channel members. If you want to support the channel, by all means, sign up and join below. There's a link below on the channel member page. It really helps the channel out. The funding is more consistent than ad revenue, and it is more easier to plan around. As I get more money coming in, we'll be doing things to make these videos a higher quality for you. So by all means, if you have the money and you want to support the channel, do that. Otherwise, just watch the videos and share to your friends. But now let's go into the rest of the video. So there's been a lot of really bad polls for Trudeau here. Like, let's straight up say this. It's a terrible, no good, very bad August. We just look here at just some raw polls. Why is this doing this? Why does it hate me? Okay, bear with me. Here we go. We can see here we have +9, +13, +12, +10 from 4 different pollsters. Now we have some Nanos polls which are a lot tighter, but Nanos clearly looks to be an outlier here. And even if you look at earlier August, we still have Abacus with a 9 and Abacus with a 10. Abacus has polled 3 different times in the last month or so, and every time has put the same margin. Even month before, Ledger's still a +9. Main Street's a 7. So you've had a big string of bad polls. So you might be thinking to yourself, you the politically savvy user or viewer who probably looks at polls or other content like this, is why the heck is your model so stubborn? Why are the quality so far behind? Well, it's pretty simple. This goes down to a matter of decision making. How I want to display things. One of the things you have in polling, in modeling, is this thing called a recency bias, because we have all of these polls. But before this, if we look just May and June, it's a lot tighter. There's only the occasional Angus Reid here that's like 8, or the most recent, there's Abacus at 7. A lot of these are very, very close. And then you also have other considerations. My model does forecast polling error, strategic voting, kind of one and the same, but effectively the end result is the same. So we get a lot more complexity in this picture, and my model has a very slow, very low recency bias when I'm not in an election. When it is an election, I increase it. After the debates, I increase it again. Why is that? Well, it's a bit of an editorial decision, but really the thought process is the closer you are to election day, the more decided voters are, so the more relevant, more recent polls are. Now, if I crank this really high, we get a conservative majority. That's just what it is. I don't have a map for that because I don't think it's particularly relevant. Because while the polls are currently saying Poilievre is sitting in an 8, 9, 10, 12 territory, when it's really just, let's say, 40 days, I don't know how valid that is. I don't know how much we should put stake into that yet. Maybe it will continue trending that way. It very well could. This could be the beginning and the start of just an absolute, total landslide. This might be the end of Trudeau. Or it could just be an anomaly because it's the summer. Or some other reason. Or it could calm down. In between elections, I don't think we should see the public's mood as moving this rapidly. So I have a much tighter constraint on it. It moves and progresses slower. But that doesn't mean right now, even if we have this slower methodology, that this is okay for Trudeau. Right now, we have the Conservatives at 158, the Trudeau at 127, and Singh at 16. This is a disaster for all the left-wing parties involved. The Green are kind of okay, but even the Green, Kitchener Centre is not safe. That's only just outside of margin of error. Mike Morris could lose his seat. unfortunately for the Greens, to mostly vote splitting. Now, possibly I will caution on the Green numbers. My model has always struggled a bit with the Greens because the small parties, the Greens and the People's Party, are a lot more tricky to forecast because their voter base is more movable. They're not as set. The likelihood that the NDP, the Bloc, the Conservatives, the Liberals are going to have massive declines or gains in voter bases between elections is not that high. We're like, even if we're talking about the Conservatives going from here, which it's roughly, or sorry, 21, which is roughly 34%, to some of the most recent polls, Main Street 7 or 41%. That's a 7% gain. That's substantial, but we're really just barely looking at a 25% increase. The Greens going from 2 to 4 is doubling their support. Now, that is not to say that is laughable or impossible. They've done that before. They've had 4 or 5% before. They could be coming back again, and that could just be an error in my model. But for now, let's discount that. Let's just look at the Green or the NDP and the Liberals. So Liberals, starting in BC, they have 5 seats here that are in play. 5 different Liberal seats in BC that they currently are winning in my model are within chance of winning. Vancouver Quandra, Vancouver Granville, Stevenson Richmond East, Delta, Fleetwood Port Kells, and Coquitlam. Apologies for any pronunciations there. Again, I try, but yeah. We could very reasonably see the Liberals knocked down to just 6 seats in BC. It could go even lower. It's not within, outside of reason, that North Vancouver or Burnaby North Seymour or even Vancouver Centre might break Conservative at the way some of the polls in BC are trending. Now, it's not a universal consensus. The most recent Ledger poll had it Liberals at 31% versus just 40% for the Conservatives. But some of these polls have had the Conservatives with a 20-point lead in BC. If that actually comes true and we see a 20-point lead in BC, this is going to be an absolute bloodbath for the left. They're going to lose. The Liberals here would lose not just the 6 margin of error seats I've highlighted, but again, they'll lose North Vancouver, Burnaby North Seymour, Vancouver Centre. The NDP could very well lose Esquimalt Saanich Sooke to the Conservatives, and Singh himself will lose to a Conservative, and also possibly New Westminster Burnaby, though that one's a bit harder. That's just a touch safer. Not a lot safer, but the fact that New Westminster Burnaby is even in debate as being competitive right now really tells you how bad the situation is for the NDP Liberal pseudo-coalition. But it does get worse when you go eastward. So first off, all the Liberal NDP seats that they've gained in Alberta are going to be gone. They're still getting shut out in Saskatchewan, and some of the polls even suggest that even the new boundaries, which disadvantage the Conservatives in northern Saskatchewan, they disadvantage the Conservatives there because the Electoral Commission wanted to make an Indigenous seat. That's like, I want to say it works out to be like 70% Métis and Native or whatever the different groups are there. Well, I'm not sure all the terms. But it works out to be like, I think, 70, 80%. And in 2021, they voted very liberal, but a lot of polls say a lot of these groups are moving very conservative, so it's probably still going to be a conservative seat, but it's harder to say. But move to Manitoba, and we're looking at Churchill, Kiwanituk, Kiwatanuke, Aski is getting closer to play. Elmwood Transcona is getting in play. It's not that unreasonable that the NDP could lose this seat as things are forecasting. Winnipeg South and St. Boniface St. Vital are also nominally in play. I don't think it's really going to happen. I wouldn't really count on those two. Or frankly, Elmwood Transcona. But it's not impossible. It's opening up. Ontario, obviously Thunder Bay Superior North here, and Algoma, Mantle, and Kapuskasing Ugh, again, sorry pronunciation. Especially the more indigenous sounding names are just... They actually are surprisingly easy to pronounce if you think about them, but the consonant collection is strange. So they catch native English speakers off going, but once someone actually tells you the pronunciation, they're usually pronounced like the pronunciation makes perfect sense. They look weird because it's a string of like the consonants and vowels together don't actually look. They obviously they don't look English speaking words because they're not English, but they actually are pronounced usually pretty close to how the English pronunciation would be. But they just kind of catch you off guard. Pro tip. But then we have Oakville, Burlington. That's a bunch of seats that are very competitive. London is looking very competitive. Kitchener again. Even Hamilton. I mean, 338 right now even has all of the outskirts of Hamilton even going conservative. It's not within reason the Conservatives could sweep that. Going into the GTA here, yeah, it's a little closer, a little tighter. It's not as clear that things are going on. It's a bit safe for the Liberals. But again, you still have Pickering, Uxbridge, Whitby, Lesser St. Markham, Stouffville, Richmond Hill, York Centre, even Etobicoke Centre are really actively in play for the Conservatives. And Mississauga and Brampton are a bit softening at this point. We're not that far out from a potential breakthrough in this region. In the GTA, in the outer GTA area, in the 416. Or is it the 905? That's the 905, sorry. In the 905. Over to the east of Ontario a bit, we are looking at, again, Glengarry, Prescott, Russell is pretty close to flipping. We have Neophene and Ottawa West. Neophene are starting to look like they could be opening up into play. These aren't good signs for the Liberals. Quebec's kind of flat, to be honest. Not much has changed there. The Blocs strengthened a little tiny bit, but we're just talking the margins here. Some of these ridings aren't that close. This one here, Argonne, Tel Le Petit Nation, is possibly going to flip Bloc, but it's a little hard to say, hard to call. Going into my home Atlantic Canada, we have most of Newfoundland and Labrador already blue. Avalon is on the cusp. It's within margin of error right now. St. John's is pretty solid for the Liberals. It's softened a little bit, but the vote splitting between everybody else means the Liberals are pretty strong here. It's very unlikely we're going to see much more movement there. Not impossible, but very unlikely. Barring some wild out of expectation miss. It's a huge search. That's like a really strong local candidate, possibly. New Brunswick, St. John's, Rothsay is just outside of the lightest bar here. It's getting a lot closer. If we continue forward with the similar polling, this is going to be safely in the Conservative column. Nova Scotia, Sydney, Victoria, Cape Breton, Canso are all already flipping over Conservative here. Central Nova's looking pretty weak, especially a lot of the news stories for Fraser right now are probably personally not good for him. It might actually hurt his personal brand in the region. And there is some inklings that there might be a particularly strong Conservative candidate who ran previously in this riding coming back. It's not certain yet. There's not actually even news down the grapevine, but a certain somebody is very politically active for someone who's not actually a sitting MP. I think you know who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to name names. And then in Prince Edward Island, naturally, Malpeque is getting pretty close. Egmont is also getting pretty close. Cardigan's actually narrowed down a little bit, but it's still not that within contention here. So that's kind of the story riding-wise. And naturally, overall, right now, the Conservatives are within 2 points of about 13 ridings. And if you stretch that a little more to within 5 points, we are looking at another 15, so about 28 total. It's perfectly within reason here. We could see 196 seats for the Conservatives. 28, 186. Apparently, even though I went to school with a lot of math is not my strong point, apparently. 186 seats is well within reason right now with zero gains in Quebec. This is not something I would have predicted 5 months ago. And more still could happen. Because again, the polls are not looking good. So let's look here. Let's look at numbers here. Actually, we don't really need to look at the historical numbers. We don't really care about the historical weeks right now. Let's just look at right now. So the ones that we need to look for are Ontario, where we have currently a 1.9 lead for the Conservatives, and BC, where we're currently at 12 points. If we believe the current polling, this should open up to like 15 points, and this should open up to like 6 or 7 soon. If that happens, it's a Conservative majority. It's not close. We're going to be looking at 70, 80 seats in Ontario for the Conservatives. We're going to be looking at probably 30 seats in BC for the Conservatives. If you just do that and you give them, again, 22 seats from those two provinces, that's obviously a majority. It's 180 seats. And they're still gaining ground in Atlantic Canada. Wow. What seems like an impossible task to some, a Conservative majority, now looks almost certain. And if you watch the Path to Victory series, what looked like a tight mission now seems almost trivial. Why? What has happened? Why is Trudeau suddenly falling apart? Well, it's pretty simple, honestly. And it's kind of counterintuitive. A lot of people think the Liberals right now are suffering and languishing because of Trudeau. This could not be further from the truth. What's holding back the Liberals now is the fact they're Liberals. I don't mean the brand of the party. I mean the ideology. Why is that? Well, it's pretty simple. A lot of the problems we're facing in Canada today are problems that liberalism, the ideology, is literally incapable of resolving. At least the modern version of liberalism that we see all around. And I think we have to make a distinction here. A lot of people say, oh, liberals in North America are not liberals in Europe. No, they really are. They're really the same beast. Now, there's different flavors of liberals, and European liberals often focus more on the right liberal side of the spectrum, whereas North American ones tend to be more left liberal, but they're mostly the same thing. There's not that much of a difference between a left and a right liberal in practice. So why, might you ask, is liberalism unable to address the current problems we're facing? Well, broadly, we have 3 problems. 1, we have housing. 2, we have cost of living. And 3, we have rising crime / drug use. Those are the 3 problems that are sinking the Liberals right now. Trudeau is a life jacket. He's holding the Liberals' head above water, or else they would already be drowning. These 3 other problems are so bad that the party would be dead without Trudeau and his personal brand and his personal charisma and the people's, particularly 60 plus, personal affection to him and his father. Remember, 60 plus generation, the boomers approximately, are the ones who really voted in Trudeau Sr. They were the young people who turned out for him en masse. Okay, so why is liberalism so particularly unsuited to dealing with these problems? Well, these problems are largely created by liberalism. They are a result of liberalism. Why is that? Well, let us look at crime. A lot of liberal policies towards crime, bail reform, sentencing reform, affirmative action in sentencing, equity policing, harm reduction, safe supply, drug decriminalization. These are liberal policies, and these policies are making the problem worse. Simple as. Why? Well, that's a more complicated question, and it would probably be an entire video in itself, but to suffice this to say, let us tackle just specifically the root cause. Things, for example, on drugs, even if we assume the liberals are correct in things like safe supply and harm reduction work, they don't actually solve the underlying problem, which is people are getting addicted to drugs. People don't naturally want to be strung out hopeless on heroin or fentanyl on the street. That's not a thing anyone wants to do. Now, people get really desperate and really hooked on drugs and end up being that way, but no one wants to be hooked on drugs. And even if we assume these two policies, safe supply and harm reduction or drug decriminalization, work to mitigate people's deaths, they're still hopelessly addicted to drugs. And it's clearly a failure. Everyone clearly sees that. No one wants to be in a neighborhood full of people hopelessly addicted to drugs. It's depressing, it's scary, and it breeds crime. Because hopeless drug addicts are not in control of their senses or their faculties and will often commit crimes to further their habit, their addiction, not entirely out of their own free will, because they're so addicted to drugs and have no help. It's really tragic, and there's nothing being done for them. And on the other side, we have crime. You can argue all you want about how you want to handle criminal justice, rehabilitation versus punitive. But it's really painfully obvious. And basically everyone knows this, and which is why this is sinking the liberals. You can't rehabilitate everybody. And even if you could, some criminals commit almost all the crimes. Maybe you could rehabilitate them. Maybe. But that doesn't mean they should get easy bail. And a lot of these policies, a lot of these criminals, you'll end up seeing roughly a Pareto distribution pop up here. Not always, not universally, but very frequently. And this roughly means about 20% of violent criminals will commit about 80% of violent crimes. It's not universally true, but it tends to happen with these things. If you lock up that 20%, you solve most of the problem. Bail reform and criminal punishment reform, especially in very early parole terms that a lot of liberal justices and liberal judges and liberal crime policy encourages, just lets these particularly violent people out on the streets more and more again. In the case of BC, we end up seeing something like, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's like 50 criminals commit almost all the crimes in BC or in Vancouver. Like the same 50 people. I believe it works out to be, I could be slightly wrong in the numbers, but you get the picture. And let's look at another one of the issues that are sinking the liberals. Probably the premier issue. If I talk to my normie friends, people who don't watch YouTube videos all the time about politics, the people who don't spend all of their day reading the political news or looking at polls or going to party conferences or any of these things, what are they thinking? What is bothering them? Houses. The amount of people I know who are so thoroughly crushed because they can't and they know they will never be able to buy a house right now is depressing. So, naturally, some of you longtime viewers of the channel will know I live in Halifax. This lovely city. The median house price is approximately $700,000. Now, some of the less well-off neighborhoods, some of the poor neighborhoods, some of the slummier neighborhoods, you might be able to get cheaper. But the nice neighborhoods with the nice schools are about $700,000-ish to buy a house. The median household income in Halifax is about a bit more than $70,000. Let's say about 75. That's with about I think it works out to be 1.5 wage earners is the average, because some people only work like half-time or part-time or something like that. If you make median income $75,000 for your household in Halifax at a $700,000 house with 7% interest rates on your mortgage, you will never buy a house. You can't save enough money to buy a house. At that much money, about $75,000, you can really only afford, even if you could get a 20% down payment, which is a tall order to ask if you are renting, because you're already probably burning most of your available money on rent, because rent is as expensive as your mortgage would be. Well, for the house you could I will caveat that. The rent you are paying would cost the same as the mortgage you could afford to buy. So in my case, I won't use my case. In a hypothetical case of the 75,000 person or dollar household income, they can roughly afford, with a solid down payment, about a $300,000 house. That $300,000 house mortgage payment is roughly what they're probably paying in rent in Halifax right now. So since they're burning all of their disposable money on rent in Halifax, they have no capacity to save money to buy a house. And even if they could, the housing market is appreciating faster than they can save money. And it's appreciating faster than they can save money, and that their wages could realistically grow. Especially considering, to touch on the cost of living crisis, the last couple years, we have seen declining real GDP per capita. So on average, once you count for inflation, people are getting poorer, at least over the last 5 or so years. All this accumulates to that a young person today can't buy a house in Halifax unless you have a two-income earning household and you both have top percentile jobs. You could not afford a house in Halifax. This impossibility is driving most people I personally know who are roughly my age, I'm 25, voting decisions. Now, they haven't all decided on who to vote for, but they've all decided not to vote for the Liberals. Because the Liberals have been in power while this crisis has went from the back in the conservative Harper era, where housing was just expensive, but you could still buy one. The prices were rising a little too fast. I think they were averaging 8% during Harper's time period at growth across the country. Not sure about Nova Scotia particularly, but across the country is about 8%. Since Trudeau, housing prices have doubled in 8 years. In Nova Scotia. I don't know about Toronto, it's probably even worse. Doubled in 8 years. That means on an average of 12.5% gain per year. Not quite, but anyways. So why is liberalism so incapable of dealing with this problem? Well, first off, Trudeau created the problem. How did he create the problem? Well, two things he's changed personally have created this problem, and is why he has very little credibility to fix this. The first is he's increased regular immigration quotas i.e. just bog standard immigration. And he's increased student visa applications that are accepted. We take roughly double the student visas we do now as we did under Harper. And on paper, we take roughly double the immigrants, though in reality, we're taking approximately 4 times. Why are we taking approximately 4 times in reality? I don't really know, but on paper, we're supposed to only take 500,000. We're taking currently about 1 million, 1.5 million, depending on who you count, through official immigration channels. Not illegal immigration, official immigration channels. Why is this a problem? Well, at the same time that we've rapidly increased population growth by bringing all of these foreign nationals into the country, who obviously need houses to live in, I do not begrudge them the desire to live in a house. I don't think they should come here to live in a tent. That's silly. At the same time, housing starts have been flat. From 2015 to 2022, housing starts did not meaningfully grow. They grew a little tiny bit in 2022 and 2021, a little bit, when interest rates were really, really low. But then interest rates grew in 2022, 2023, and now we've hit an all-time low for housing starts. Housing construction hasn't boomed. Now, why it hasn't boomed is a really complicated question, and it's really outside of the scope of this video. But the general gist here is, while housing construction supply has utterly stagnated, immigration has utterly boomed. So why are the Liberals particularly incapable of dealing with this more than anyone else? Well, they can't, and they will not, meaningfully reduce immigration. They are ideologically supporting immigration because liberalism, the ideology, thinks immigration is only a good thing, that there's no negatives and there's no downsides. So liberals, small l liberals, or small l as in they are liberal ideologically, but not liberal the party. They might be liberal the party too, for the record. Don't really disagree with the idea of immigration. Now, some might, you can find some who are anti-immigration or skeptical of immigration. But generally the consensus in liberalism is immigration is a good thing. That more people is always better because it grows the economy, and growing the economy is exponential, etc., etc. They don't see any downsides. They don't see any socialized costs. But they're also equally and uniquely incapable at increasing supply. Because liberals, at least in the West, the more left liberal types that we have in Trudeau, are abhorred at the idea of reducing things like corporate tax rates or regulations, or even building government housing themselves, as you have seen that Trudeau hasn't commissioned any. Most of the provincial liberal parties that exist don't really build, ones that are left, that is, don't really commit to building socialized housing. So they don't build housing themselves, and they are not super pro-business, so they don't want to encourage developers to build houses for them. So they don't want to use any of the tools to build houses, and they don't want to use any of the tools to decrease demand by reducing immigration quotas. So they're incapable of fixing this problem. And this is what will sink the Liberal Party. And Trudeau's the only thing buoying the party right now. And if we don't see any action taken on this, which I don't think they will do, because I think they're ideologically incapable of doing this, we will see the Liberal Party sink under the weight that is this core policy plank, being immigration. That is one of their goals. That was one of the things they ran to do, to increase quotas so we could have more immigration settle in Canada and that could grow our economy. And now, to be clear, technically speaking, our economy is growing quite rapidly, but it's growing rapidly because the population is booming, not because people are making more money or productivity is increasing. Our real GDP per capita is decreasing at the same time our nominal GDP is growing faster than the rest of the G7. About 3% nominal GDP growth last year, but once you count for inflation, we lost about 1% per capita. Sorry, population growth. Sorry. We lost about 1% per capita. Or inflation, whatever. You know what I mean. Now the last one, cost of living. Well, this is related to housing in the sense that the immigration does make it harder for wages to go up for a very lot of complicated reasons that I really can't touch into. If you want to see that, comment below and I could try to squeeze that in, probably, maybe. But more broadly, we see the Liberals, and the two things that really hold the country down here, more than anything else, we could have all the immigration in the world, and if we did this, it would be fine. Or mostly fine. Is their climate policies, which they can't pivot on. It's too core and too close to the party and the ideology of modern liberalism. Their climate policies strangle the only sector that Canada is currently competitive in with the world, which is resource production. We have oodles and oodles of oil, heavy oil, actually, which is really useful for making plastics, among other things. Some people will say the oil sands oil sucks because it's heavy oil, but by God, that's actually the best kind of oil in the world right now. That's the oil we need to build plastics, to make pharmaceuticals, to make petroleum jelly, to name some random products. You want your doctors to have plastic gloves? You better hope there's heavy oil around. Why do you think it's heavy? It has long chain hydrocarbons that you use to make plastic. Saudi sweet light crude is great if you want gasoline. You could sort of use gasoline to make gloves, but you're not really gonna do that. It's not really cost effective compared to heavy oil. Anyways, that's a side note. But it's not just oil. Mining projects are also heavily throttled across the country. There's huge regulatory regimes on it. It's very difficult to open mines in the country. Very, very, very difficult. And things like the carbon tax are also throttling all sorts of industries. There was a report a while back from a steel plant that the existence of the carbon tax basically reduces their export share quota to the European Union by, I want to say I don't recall the exact numbers, but it was something along the effect of every like $10 of the carbon tax reduced their export share by like 0.1% or something like that, which doesn't sound like a big deal. But when you're talking about a $300 carbon tax, which is the goal by 2030, you're looking at a 3% decrease in market share, which is very substantial for nothing. So they're just selling less product for no benefit to themselves. It's not like their product better. It's not like it's worth more. They just sell less of it. And yes, you can argue about whether that is good or not on the climate change portfolio. But at the end of the day, it does stifle and hurt and make the Canadian economy uncompetitive, which makes cost of living more expensive here. If you want the Canadian economy to boom, what you need to do is increase the ability for us to export, really. Yes, you can, if you have a big enough and diverse enough and a complex enough economy, grow your economy through internal demand and internal consumption. Usually, a country roughly the size of 40 million people, such as Canada, is better suited to grow their economy by exporting to foreign consumers. And there's plenty of foreign consumers. The European Union, China, the US. Plenty of foreign consumers. And if you are really concerned about, say, a country like Russia right now, Canadian exports of minerals or oil would be really good for our allies. But alas, we don't do that. So we have collectively for Trudeau is he has a party who is incapable, likely, of pivoting from this. I think potentially if the Liberals could conjure up another leader who is sufficiently distinct and sufficiently charismatic and sufficiently vocal, they could replace Trudeau with someone else and try to do a hard pivot. I don't think they could do that. I don't think there's anyone yet in the wings for the Liberal Party. And what the Liberal Party's doing instead, what we're seeing Trudeau do, because if he's incapable of acting on these portfolios, he hasn't done anything at all on any of these three things. What he's doing instead is he's doing window dressing. He's talking about particularly random and arbitrary social issues. Random is the wrong word. Very arbitrary social issues. And pretending that this is actually solving something of note. Trying to distract Canadians, basically. The most obvious and notable ones, abortion and guns, he talks about all the time. He tries to actually use guns specifically about crime as, we're going to fight crime by banning handguns or something stupid like that. It's like, that's not going to do anything. Legal handguns are used in a rounding error of gun crimes. Almost entirely because some other repeat criminal had already stolen the gun. But even then, even including theft, is still a rounding error. Most of the time, they just buy an imported illegal gun, these criminals, these gang members. Or another recent one he's gone into, because it looks like he might be softening in a lot of very key minority groups, such as the Muslim. I say key because they inhabit potential swingy seats. They're very concentrated in a few seats, in other words. So if their community, I guess, swings one particular way or the other, some of these minority groups can cause elections or seat changes. But something like the Muslims or I think the Sikhs, too, have been complaining about parental rights, and they don't want their kids being taught about LGBT stuff in schools. And whatever side you are on that issue, pro or against, the reality there is it's a very minor issue. Now, socially focused voters probably really care about it. But the average person who's thinking to themselves, gee, I will never own a house, doesn't care. Your average suburban Halifax voter truly does not care. Maybe your parent who has a 6-year-old kid might care a little bit. If they have a house, they might care a little more. But if they are living in an apartment, even if they have small kids and they want to buy a house, they probably really don't care that much. If they'd rather have housing go cheaper. And you also have the open issue, too, of how many actual socially liberal people are not already voting for the NDP or the Liberals. Sure, you could probably argue that if they could win some of the NDP voters over to the Liberal Party, it would increase their voter efficiency a little bit or something. Yeah, maybe. Could help them a little bit. Wouldn't help them that much. And what it really comes down to is what really seems to be happening is a lot of liberal voters, people who voted for the Liberal Party in 2021, 2019, seem like that seem to be going to stay home. A lot of them are leading the electorate right now. They're not switching conservative. They're not switching. Some might be switching bloc, to be honest. They're not switching green. They're not switching NDP. They're staying home. Why? Well, they might not know it on a cerebral level, but they probably know it on an instinctual level that their party of choice can't fix problems right now. But they also don't like anyone else. If you don't like the NDP and you don't like the Conservatives and you are a liberal person, but you know the Liberal Party can't solve your problem, why would you vote? What's in it for you? What are you going to get? More of the same? Now, if you believe the Liberals can solve your problem, it makes absolute sense to go vote for them. What seems to be happening, and we see this too in the UK with the Conservatives in the UK, is a lot of these voters don't think their party can solve their problem, so they're just not going to vote. And then on the reverse side of the problem, the Conservatives seem to be gaining voters from the vastnesses of people who don't vote. That's likely what's causing the surge in Atlantic Canada for the Conservatives. Is Poilievre's went and he's gotten young voters in Atlantic Canada to vote Conservative. It's very unlikely you're going to convince someone who's 60 to switch their vote. Not impossible. It does happen. But usually you don't. Because the older you get, the more set in your voting ways you are. If you voted the same way for 30 years, you're less likely to vote that way. And usually by the time you're 60, if you are at even remotely invested in politics, you probably have a very strong ideological worldview. If you're younger, it's a lot easier to sway you, especially if right now everything sucks. And can you really say anything is going well for someone who's under the age of 40 in Canada? You can't buy a house. Raising a kid's incredibly expensive. You probably went to university and got $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in student debt, and you're getting a job that can barely afford you to go to rent an apartment. Your groceries cost you like 10% of your disposable income? Just your groceries? After you burned 50% on your rent? So what, you have 60% of your income gone right that. Then you have transit. Then you have the basic things, the basic creature comforts you have right now. Like your cell phone, your internet plan, buying yourself clothes or hygienic products. You're probably burning almost all your money already. Saving things, transportation, saving for retirement. You easily have almost burned your entire income, even if you have a good job. Now, if you're not renting somewhere, if you're fortunate that you can live with family, or you inherited a house, or if you're really lucky and you could buy a house before they got really expensive, maybe you're doing okay. But most people didn't. Especially if you are like myself or my friends and graduated post-COVID. The odds of that you ever had the capital for a down payment when houses weren't stupid expensive is basically zero. It's not hard to take someone like that, especially if they haven't voted before, and convince them, you should vote for me, I'm going to solve your problems. And let's be clear. Let's be very, very, very clear here. I'm not entirely sure if Poilievre could solve your problems. Now, he's promising to. He's saying things that the Liberals can't say. He's giving a bunch of ideas on how to increase construction. The Liberals are silent on this issue. Now, he hasn't talked about, per se, immigration quotas or student visa quotas, but he's hinted at it. There's a possibility he can. There's a reason why someone might gamble on Poilievre. There's no reason someone's going to gamble on Trudeau right now. On housing. On crime and drugs, that's a slam dunk. Poilievre objectively opposes all of the things the Liberals are doing. Maybe that will turn out to be a bad policy. Maybe. I'm not saying to say it won't. But the current policy doesn't work at all. So why would you keep the current one? There's a reason, again, to vote for Poilievre on that if you haven't voted before. And that's where we really seem to see Poilievre be growing. Abacus Data did a poll, and they found one of the most recent polls, one that they polled that considers about 38% nationally, just a touch lower than I currently have them. And they determined 11% of that 38% had never voted before. That's roughly 4% of their voters. That means almost all of the voters the Conservative Party has gained since 2021 are new voters. People who've never voted before. if we believe the abacus numbers. Now, we don't have lots of data on this from other pollsters. Most people don't actually publish that data. They probably know it, for the record, if they're competent at their job. They just haven't published it. But if we accept abacus's numbers, that's a substantial amount of voters. We're talking about possibly a million Canadians who've never voted before. Who never, ever, ever voted before. Or at least didn't vote in 2021 or 2019. Deciding, I'm going to vote for Poilievre. And at the same time, in these abacus polls, we're seeing 10-15% of the Liberal voters are undecided. Now, undecided, when it talks about party partisans, doesn't mean, oh, I'm on the fence who I should vote for. Usually, people vote for the party they voted for last time. Roughly 80 to 90% of voters vote for the same party they voted last time. Now, because about 10% don't always vote the same way, you can easily have situations where you have a voter who's voted for every party in their lifetime. That could easily happen. But usually, 80-90% vote the same way. So if you're now looking at 70% are voting the same way, because you're having about 20% defections and 10% undecided, or 15% undecided and 15% defecting, or even worse, 20% defecting and 20% undecided. Some of the polls have put in that ballpark. That usually means that undecided voters are on the fence, not about should I vote Conservative or should I vote NDP. It's should I vote? They're not undecided between NDP and Liberal, or Green and Liberal, or Bloc and Liberal. It's Liberal or not voting. Now, that is actually promising for the Liberals if they can muster the courage and the willpower to do something to fix these issues, which probably, in my position as an analyst and someone who talks about this all the time and researches this all the time, would likely require them to break their ideological precepts and do something different, admit mistakes and reverse policies. They have the chance to rally a bunch of their voters together. They have 10 to 20% they could probably get back right away. And that could probably get them back to 31, 32, maybe even 33% again, because a lot of NDP voters are defecting because this thing just sucks. So there's potential. There's potential. But it seems like the Trudeau's going to let it slip from his fingers. Maybe it's not even Trudeau. Maybe it's just the party brass at home. It'll actually be something that'll be quite interesting to see in the history books when we can see behind the doors of the Liberal Party here and figure out why they stood feet planted firmly in the sand as Poilievre ran lap and lap and lap around them on the three biggest issues sinking them. Now, these might not be the three biggest issues, but when the three biggest issues that are hurting your government are all ones that you're doing nothing about and are all naturally in the wheelhouse of your opponent, that is catastrophic. But with that, I will end the video here. If you liked the video, by all means, like, share, subscribe, comment below what you think. And once again, if you want to support the channel, join below as a member. But with that, I will bid you adieu and see you, I think, next week. But I'll keep you posted with, what's the word for it? Community posts, if that changes. See you next time.